Hey, good evening, good morning, whenever you're looking at this, whatever time of day it is. Hope it's well for you. Um, it is Thursday, which means we are almost through our first week of this madness. This next assignment you guys are going to be working on is going to kind of span out for the next 3 days. So you'll have Thursday, Friday, and then Monday to finish this. I have it kind of sectioned out into 3 parts. Each part is a day. So the first part will be ideally get done Thursday, the second part Friday, and then the third part on Monday. So again, if you hopefully you finish the first assignment, we're really starting to dive into this idea of ecology and how organisms interact within different environments, and specifically within communities and ecosystems. Everything we kind of do here for the first part of this unit is probably going to be a lot of review from what you've done in middle school. So I'm approaching it as more of a review session, more than me teaching you everything. So make sure if you have questions from this stuff, if you're not 100% sure, make sure you say something to me. Shoot me an email and I'll kind of shift gears and change where I'm at with that, to make sure you guys are taken care of. But I believe that you covered a lot of this in middle school. Usually that is the case. And so everything we're kind of doing for the next few days will be a lot of review. Okay. So I wanted to throw some notes at you here real quick, super short. Feel free to write these down if you'd like. This slide deck is going to be attached at the top of your assignment so you can view it as well. It will be there accessible to you, and it'll also be on Canvas as well. So what we're going to start diving into today is looking at food chains and food webs. Okay. These hopefully are something that are pretty familiar to you. They are not super complicated, but what you will notice is that we're throwing a ton of terminology, a ton of new terms, new words, new vocabulary terms at you that we're going to be using consistently. So, yesterday we looked at organism, community, population, ecosystem, habitat, those different things. Today we're going to throw a bunch more at you, a lot of which you should be pretty familiar with. So to start us off, some of the key terms that we need to know are what we call different organisms, based on what they do, what they eat, or what they provide for others to eat. The first of which is what we call a producer. Producer is another name for plants. Okay, plants produce food. Okay, think about it. Plants produce their own food through the process of photosynthesis, using light energy from the sun to make their own sugar that we talked about during our photosynthesis unit. So they produce their own food, which is why we call them producers. Another word we use for these guys is autotrophs. Okay, autotrophs. Auto means self, trophs mean feed. So they're self-feeders. They make their own food. Okay, that is a producer. The second term we have is a consumer. So you have producers, which make their own food, and then you have consumers who, guess what? They consume their own food. So these are organisms who cannot make their own food. They must eat plants and other animals to get their energy. These guys we call heterotrophs. Okay, hetero is a word that we've seen before. It means other or different. Okay, and then troph again is feed. So they feed off others, or they feed differently. These guys are probably what you are most familiar with because this is what we are. We are consumers, right? Now, with consumers, there's 3 types of those consumers that we have. The first of which is what we call an herbivore. These guys only eat plants. Herb, that's plant. Okay, and then ivore, they eat. So they eat plants. Okay. Second is carnivore. Carn or carne, if you think about it, you foreign language speakers. that is meat, right? So meat is what these guys are eating. So they are only eating other animals, carnivores are. And then the last form of consumer we have is an omnivore, which is a consumer who eats both plants and animals. Okay, so these are eating both of those things. So technically, you could consider yourself an omnivore if you eat meat and you eat plants as well. Excuse me. And then there's a couple miscellaneous categories that we have. Additionally to those guys, we have these guys called scavengers. Scavengers are organisms that often feed off dead organisms. So think of like a vulture. These are going to be scavengers, right? They prey on leftovers, roadkill, other opportunities, or basically they're just eating dead things that are left to rot. The last classification that we have is what we call a decomposer. And these guys break down dead and decaying plants and animals. They are a huge part of recycling organic matter, recycling nutrients back into the environment. Okay, so think bacteria and fungus as being these guys. So if something dies, it rots away. Usually that's occurring due to the help of decomposers. Generally, you think something dead laying, there's bugs all over it, right? Or there's microorganisms all in it. That generally is your decomposers. So those are our classifications. Those are our terms that we're going to be using a lot here in this lesson. There's another set of terms that we're going to introduce here when we look at food webs and food pyramids. So the three classifications we're going to use here, well, technically there's four. We have the producers. Then we have our primary consumers. So these are the herbivores. These are the guys that are only going to eat the producers. Then we have the secondary consumers, which are our carnivores and omnivores. And then our tertiary consumers, who are going to eat other carnivores and your secondary consumers. Okay, so what you'll notice here as we kind of get into these food webs and food chains is you'll see that generally these are tiered, right? So you start with the sun, and then it goes up into a group of organisms, and then every layer is a different group. We classify these layers based on what these organisms eat, and we label them either being primary consumers, secondary consumers, or tertiary consumers. So looking at this food web, this is kind of, let me see if I have a little simpler one here. So let's use this. Okay, so we have a grasshopper. Okay, a grasshopper is going to eat our producer. So the grasshopper would be considered our primary consumer. Okay, then we have a frog, and the frog is going to eat the grasshopper. Okay, so that makes him the secondary consumer because he's eating the primary consumer. Okay, and then we have our snake. Now our snake is eating our secondary consumer, so that makes our snake a tertiary consumer. Okay, and then our hawk is going to eat the snake. Now, the hawk could also eat the frog. Okay, but really what we're going to stick our classifications to is tertiary is the highest we're going to talk about. Okay, so once we get to that tertiary level, any level after that, it's still going to be a tertiary consumer. Okay, so we have primary, secondary, tertiary, tertiary. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So when we look at food webs, the biggest thing that we're looking at here is the flow of energy in an ecosystem. Okay, energy always moves throughout a system. It never changes. It just flows from one thing to another. Okay, that's something we know about energy. Energy is never created nor destroyed. It simply is just transferred from one form to another or from one organism to another. So when we look at these food webs, as chaotic as they look, all we're seeing is the energy from the sun is moving from each organism as that organism is eaten by another organism. Okay. So food chains, you're going to see two different terms: food chains, food webs. Food chains are going to be looking at one particular organism and the thing that it eats, and then a direct chain of things that eat that. So if we look back here, this is a food chain. We have a grasshopper gets eaten by a frog, frog gets eaten by a snake, snake gets eaten by a hawk. Now, a food web is when we put in all the organisms within an ecosystem. So instead of just the frog eating this grasshopper, we also might have a rabbit, right? And so then the rabbit is going to get eaten by something, and then so that adds another chain, which starts to develop the web, right? So this is a chain. This is a web. A food web is looking at the flow of energy throughout an entire ecosystem. Okay. So the arrows in a food chain, food web, represent the flow of energy. They point in the direction where the energy is going. Okay. And one of the things you're going to be challenged to think about here is how much energy is passed from thing to thing throughout these food webs and food chains. Okay, so let me skip through here and get to this. Okay, so when we look at food chains, a ecological pyramid, food pyramid is simply just looking at your producers, and as you get up higher, that's your primary, secondary, tertiary consumers. It's just a visual that we use to kind of show the flow of energy with these guys. But what I really want to talk about is this idea here, in that when you look at each of these tropic levels, and tropic levels are meaning each of these levels, producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, each of those is a tropic level. When you look at these guys, only 10% of the energy is transferred from one tropic level to the next. Okay, so think about this. Okay, so we know that this plant here produces its own energy, and it gets that energy from the sun, right? It produces its own food, which it's getting the energy from the sun to produce that. So that plant starts with, let's just call it 100 joules of energy. Okay, so 100 joules. Joules is the measurement of energy that we use. Okay, so if it has 100 joules of energy, we know that when it gets eaten by one of these three guys, it is only going to pass on about 10% of the energy that it has stored. So if it has 100 joules, the gazelle is only going to get 10 joules of that 100, right? And then when that gazelle gets eaten by the cheetah is only going to get 10% of that, right? So again, plant had 100, it passes 10% of that energy off to the gazelle, which is 10 joules, and then the gazelle's going to pass 10% of that energy off to the cheetah, which is going to be 1 joule, right? And so what you start to see is as you get higher up into these tropic levels, the less amount of energy you're getting from the things that you're eating, right? And we're talking the original energy that is stored from the food that is eaten by that organism, okay? And the reason why it's only 10% is because 90% is lost by heat, right? So think about it. All the things that your body is doing to stay alive and function, all of that 90% is being used to make that stuff work, right? And when your body moves and does things and makes things happen, that's producing heat. That energy is then lost. Okay, so you'll be asked to kind of look at that 10% rule in your assignment. So just remember, every tropic level, you only get 10% from the previous tropic level. Okay, that energy dissipates as it moves from tropic level to tropic level. Okay, so a lot of terms here for you, a lot of different things. Biggest thing to remember is obviously we always start with our producers, then we move up into those tropic levels, which are our primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. Hey y'all, sorry I had to cut that because I only have 20 seconds left, I just wanted to say, please make sure you email me. Let me know if you have any questions with this assignment. I think you will do just fine. Just use the notes, use the slides, and just read those questions very, very carefully. Have a great one. Miss y'all. See you later.